Brad Bernthal, who will be moderating this conversation on innovating for trust. Brad is an associate professor at Colorado Law and is also the director of the Silicon Flatirons Entrepreneurship Initiative and an expert on, I cannot have words being pronounced this morning.
Amy, that's not your fault. I've been stumbling over that ungainly title for a long time.
We'll make it shorter. Brad is also an expert on startups and entrepreneurial law. Welcome, Brad.
Thank you, Amy. And I also want to say thank you to the full Silicon Flatirons team. This Tilt conference is a big production, as you saw from the last panel, also a really high caliber set of discussions, and kudos to the whole of Silicon Flatirons team and everybody for putting an oar in the water. This panel is going to be looking at innovation and trust with a particular focus on responses and actions to increase trust and mitigate problems after trust is damaged or lost. The panel has a lot of lived experience with this, and I'll be introducing the panelists here momentarily. I think it's going to be an excellent discussion given their depth of experience. We're going to go deep on three areas. The first, conceptualizing trust. That is, what do we mean by it broadly? And then in particular situations, what do we mean by trust? Second, contextualizing trust. Trust is one value. How does this sit against other values in rolling out a product or service? And third, operationalizing trust. Principles only go so far. The devil's in the details. How do you go about operationalizing that? And when we talk about innovation, at the end of the day, this is about bringing something to market. And so we'll get into the details where our panelists have deep expertise. The way that we'll move forward with this panel is we will have a discussion for about 50 minutes or so, 55 minutes, somewhere around 11:10, 11:15 Mountain Time. We will turn to the Q&A, but I want to invite everybody along the way. Please drop your questions directly into the Q&A box, and we will pick them up over the last 15, 20 minutes of today's discussion. So I want to encourage you to drop your questions in along the way. I'll provide some brief introductions as we get going, and then we'll launch into discussion. I want to welcome Molly Wilson, who's a senior researcher and designer with Simply Secure. She is an interaction designer who focuses on complex products in finance, health, and education. It occurred to me, Molly, I've got some complex problems in my household that we could use some interaction design around. Molly has taught programs in design thinking and innovation processes since 2010, first at the D School, which had to be a fun time to be there in 2010, by the way, and later at the Hasso-Plattner Institute of Design Thinking in Potsdam, Germany. Jeremy Grant, welcome, is the managing director at Venable, and he is part of their cybersecurity and risk management group. In a prior life, Jeremy established and led the first new cybersecurity program launched by the Obama administration called the National Program Office for the National Strategy for Trusted Identities in Cyberspace. Jeremy, I trust you did not come up with that title, but that was situated within NIST, and that'll be an interesting experience to draw upon for this discussion. Also, welcome to Frank Torres. Frank is the Director of Public Policy in the Office of Responsible Artificial Intelligence for Microsoft. By way of background, Frank spent 17 years in the company's U.S. Governmental Affairs team in Washington, D.C., where he was the Director of Consumer Affairs and Senior Policy Counsel. He is part of Microsoft's Technology and Corporate Responsibility Group, and he helps with Microsoft's public policy positions on responsible development and deployment of AI. Finally, Danielle Varda is the CEO of Visible Network Labs, as well as an associate professor at the University of Colorado, Denver School of Public Affairs. Danielle is a scientist turned startup founder. She has 12 years as a tenured professor at the University of Colorado, Denver, and is a network scientist who studies social connectedness and health. And as I mentioned, is the founder and now CEO of Visible Network Labs. So welcome to our panel. Looking forward to this discussion. Topic one, conceptualizing trust. Let's start by nailing down what concept do you broadly have in mind when you use the word trust? What is this to mean to you? Molly, I'm going to start with you because I think you have a provocative view about trust insofar as you've said that in your view, trust has become something of a technique. that tries to, in your words, get the consumer over a trust hump despite their better instincts. Why do you think that is a problematic conception of trust? And what approach
Thanks
do you
for
espouse?
asking. Yeah, when I first people started coming to us saying we would like to design something trustworthy, how can we get people to trust the thing that we're making? This comes, I think, from a 2016 TED Talk by the founder of Airbnb, Joe Gebbia, that really took off, where he said, you can design for trust. You can design something that people will trust. What he says, however, in this TED Talk is, you can make something that is so smooth, so convincing, looks so good, that people will do something they wouldn't otherwise do. They will let complete strangers sleep in their houses. They will let complete strangers come into their houses, and like people will be okay with this. He then talks about these kind of like sleight of hand techniques that the Airbnb design team uses to, quote, create trust. This has, I think, engendered this idea that trust is something you can build sort of out of nowhere, rather than a relational quality that builds up over time between two different actors. I know that Danielle must know a lot about this, though, from her work on trust and networks, and I'd be interested to hear her point of view as well.
Well, thanks, Molly. Already provocative. We think of trust in a couple of ways, and we are a data science company. So there's issues that we have in, thoughts from the last panel on how trust is conceptualized in the use of and collection of data. But also we think a lot about trust in we create measures of how people relate to one another and partnerships and collaboration. And there's a lot of questions about who gets to decide how those measures are developed and created. And, how are we representing the lived experiences of the people who we believe are going to use those, our technology and our data collection platform, so that the data that is collected accurately represents them and represents their diverse views and experiences. And so one of the things that one way we really think a lot about trust is being sure to honor those lived experiences and letting users and our customers know that it's as important that we bring good science and technology to the table, but we're only half of that equation, and the other half is their conceptualization of their perceptions of their relationships and the way that they have differences across different types of communities. When we're working with the community in Detroit on a network building or systems building initiative, it's very different from those in Denton, Texas. The history of their collaborations and partnerships are so different. So by letting them know that we honor that and that we actually want to hear their voice in it, we really conceptualize trust as a reciprocal relationship. And to be authentic, you have to be quiet at times and really listen, and then show them that we are incorporating those concepts and those measures into the products that we're producing.
And I know that you guys actively measure trust, and I assume as a quantitative matter through the interviews. I guess and that might be an incorrect assumption. What sorts of questions do you ask to get at trust, and what conception of trust do you think that the feedback that you hear helps you measure?
Yeah, and thanks for giving me these questions now, because I'm not a lawyer and I know very little about some of the things I just learned about in the last panel. So I appreciate these. Measuring trust is something I spend a lot of time doing. We measure what we call social connectedness. And social connectedness, is a broad concept, but the idea of, that there is an adverse social connectedness that people can experience. One way that plays out in, we have a product that can screen a person on their social connectedness. And one of the most adverse ways that someone can experience adverse social connectedness is by being connected to a lot of people, which typically in a network would be a positive thing. However, if those people they are highly dependent on, but they don't trust them to help them when they need it. So suddenly that becomes our actually highest risk person in our measures, much more so than a person who's very isolated and maybe only connected to one person, although they don't depend on them much, but they trust them when they need it. That's one example. And a second is we spent about a year with funding from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation just studying how to measure trust and value, two concepts that are really important in networking and partnerships. And what we did during that time is we just interviewed people and literally just asked them, how do you know trust exists? What does it look like to you? And just took their words. It was a qualitative process over a year. And we turned that into metrics that we now use in the data platform that are quantitative measures. And what we came up with were three buckets, and we never use the word trust. When people are asked to rate each other on their perceptions of trust, we actually never use the word, because if you ask someone, how do you trust someone on the scale of 1 to 10? It is just completely arbitrary what that 5 is, right? So we actually have a scale, and what we ask people to rate their partners on is reliability, mission congruence, and time commitment. It's in a certain context of network building. But what we've learned is that last one, I'm sorry, not time commitment, openness to discussion, that's a value measure, time commitment. And those first, reliability and mission congruence, has to do with the nature of the network, but openness to discussion was the one that people talked about most. And I'll just end with this. What we learned is, they said, when you are in a meeting like this and we're all talking and we can be open and we know trust exists, but the moment, the new person walks in with all the power or whatever it is, it's not trusted, the whole conversation changes and we can't be as open. So just being able to, bring forward the hard conversations and things like that. So that was really dynamic in a really interesting way. We were able to think about trust.
Super helpful. Frank, I'm going to turn to your work with Microsoft and AI. You've heard Molly and Danielle's conceptions of trust. How do you think about it?
Yeah, so when you mentioned this in one of the planning mails, I actually went back to the dictionary definition of trust, and it talks about relying on the character, ability, or truth of someone or something, and that goes to, I think, to in our view, are you reliable and are you safe? The part of the definition that I think really hits home is placing confidence in, right? Placing confidence in. So if you're a company, what makes people place confidence in you and what you do? And in our work on responsible AI, it kind of takes me back to the principles that we've incorporated and that we talked about. And I know we'll talk later about putting those principles into practice, but it's about, what do people care about? What are people talking about today even? And I think it hits really the principles around whether it be fairness or transparency and explainability and accountability is kind of some governing principles. But then you also talk about inclusiveness, safety and reliability. How do you treat the data? Do you treat the data with respect? And do you keep the information that you have secure? And so, for us, it's easy to talk about trust conceptually, but it's really, the proof is in the proverbial pudding, right? It's kind of what you do, what actions you take, your corporate culture, and how you develop that, and pick the issue, whether it be responsible AI or privacy or security, big issues in the tech sector. What are you doing to foster that, and how do you act when things go wrong, and hopefully you make things go right more of the time, and how do you learn and how do you communicate what you're doing with the outside world?
Yeah, that's an interesting dimension of this, that trust really is something that is in communication with another, right? Or at least in reference to another. And the communication aspect of that is something to keep in mind. Jeremy, elements to add, or how do you think about what you've heard so far?
Yeah, well, one great discussion, and it kind of has my mind, thinking about how to approach this. You mentioned my time in government when I ran the national strategy for trusted identities in cyberspace. And that was a word the Obama administration ended up embracing after the original draft was the national strategy for secure online transactions. And I think they got a lot of feedback. It's not just about security, we need to elevate it. But trust is a bit of a loaded and a bit of an overused term, I think. Within the identity space, a lot of what that strategy, and I think where the identity world in general has tried to focus, is this idea of what they call trust frameworks. The idea being, if we can define a set of technical standards as well as operating and business rules that everybody has to follow, you wrap all of that up together, and then you somehow have trust. And I remember, being in at least a couple conversations where, one person or another wanted to argue, trust is still the wrong word. It's really accountability. We should call them accountability frameworks. And my take was, maybe, but that doesn't quite have the same ring as trust. I think trust is something everybody, somebody said, how do you define it? And I said, well, it's hard to define, but I know if I don't trust a service or trust a person, I'm not going to have anything to do with them. And I think part of the challenge is that everybody defines trust a little bit differently in terms of what that means for them. And so it is both an overused term, but I think also a great term, and that I think everybody sort of, looks at it the same at the end of the day. If you don't clear that trust bar, I'm not going to have anything to do with you.
Let me drill down on a couple things, and I'll just make this a jump ball. When we think about innovation, at least in terms of a new product or a new service, the company that's rolling this out has a strong interest in typically selling the product or service in a way that benefits the company. When we think about trust, and I'm going to make an extreme version of trust coming from law, a fiduciary relationship is one of extreme trust, where a fiduciary is put in a position of trust to act for the benefit of a beneficiary. And that is a very different relationship than the one that I think of in most company sales contexts, in which I've got a product or service. I don't really care if it's in your best interest in the long term. I care about making money today. And then I put that in contrast to the fiduciary relationship that we think about in trust. Is it too much of an ask for companies for us to impose this sort of fiduciary version of trust in products and services or in their relationships with their customers? And Molly, I'm going to put that to you, because I think that you do have a sense that trust is something more than something that's just superficial, and it needs to be deeper. Am I asking for too much in sort of a fiduciary sense of trust?
I think you absolutely are not. Has anybody heard of the term dark patterns? This is a design term. I prefer the term manipulative patterns, because then you get like the dark light. I don't know, it's kind of weirdly racist colorist. So let's say manipulative patterns, but dark patterns is a term you'll hear a lot, meaning design decisions that make people do things they otherwise would not want to do. For example, making it very hard to stop a recurring charge, like the commissioner in the last panel talked about. Making it difficult to see what the pricing is, making returns difficult, making harassment very difficult to report, or people difficult to block, or putting all of the burden on users to stand up for themselves throughout kind of like a maze of like difficult to find small links. I'm sure we've all been trapped in these dark patterns before. It does not have to be these way once you realize that people did this on purpose. Like when I became an interaction designer, it made me realize how many of these choices are choices made by people. You think, oh, it just kind of has to be this way. But then you think, well, this button could actually be larger, or it could be smaller. This could be buried deep in the settings, or it could be the first thing that people see. There is no law of nature that says that people have to be treated like they have to be tricked. There's no law of nature that says that people sort of have to be treated like rubes. So techniques like not making information required, making commitments and pricing clear up front, telling people why you're asking things, letting people skip and repeat parts, just giving people a lot more freedom and control to move about within your service. I think this actually is not going to be as much of a business. I unfortunately don't have citations for you, but it's not like, it sounds like this is going to be the death knell for your business, but there are plenty of companies that actually operate perfectly transparently and seem to be doing fine. I think it's just that this model has been popularized by a few companies that happen to have had this like hockey stick growth. And so everybody thinks they have to do this. I could go off on this for a while. I'm going to go back on mute and let some other people chime in.
No, that's great. And just a footnote for those who are part of the conference on day one, Caroline Cinders actually did about 15 minutes on precisely this topic, Molly. So it's super, right in the pocket for where the conference is.
Oh yeah, Caroline and I are good friends. Yeah.
Frank, maybe I'll turn to you and say, okay, you're in a conversation at Microsoft along these lines, and there might be some tension between engagement of customers and a product that keeps people using and it's sticky. Even if there's some trade-off of trust. Is there an example that you've had either in the AI context or otherwise at Microsoft, and how does that cash out?
I don't have a specific example, but I can kind of generalize a little bit that'll give people an idea. Listen, I don't think we succeed as a company at Microsoft unless we provide some benefit to our customers, both enterprise and consumer customers. And I agree with Molly with the notion that, for companies that do work hard to make things stickier in ways that are manipulative. Listen, in this day and age, there's kind of no hiding, just because there's enough researchers, academics, and others, members of civil society, who are digging in deeper. They're building up technical capacity as well to uncover a lot of what's happening. And they all know the names and addresses of all the FTC commissioners and staff. And so it's you listen and learn, and companies do things well. Sometimes you make mistakes. But just I know from my discussions internally, particularly since I've started in the Office of Responsible AI, when I'm talking to engineers, it's really kind of, sometimes it's a struggle and sometimes it's challenging, but it's really kind of as we build, more internal muscle and more internal learnings and learnings from, external entities as well, as we share those learnings and grow and changing the culture, that we're just getting better about making sure that we're providing benefit, that we're not doing anything intentionally to manipulate customers. I mean, that's just not going to lead to long-term success. So I guess sometimes are you taking the short-term view of like just following who's ever doing the latest kind of thing, or are you taking a longer-term view? And that's one issue that I see in just 3 recent cases of use of artificial intelligence. It's, everyone from Stanford using it to determine vaccine distribution, and that didn't go so well, to test monitoring when it really didn't account for, people with accessibility needs or childcare needs, and you leave the computer for very legitimate reasons, you get dinged in terms of the test monitoring, or in the UK using it for A-level determinations of who gets into what universities. It's all kind of uses that if you sat down and thought about it, should never have been allowed. But I'm sure somebody got enthusiastic, perhaps on one side, and then there's a definite need on the other side. And so in the same situation that you're talking about, to me, that there's almost some parallels to the manipulation a little bit, in that you're using things that maybe you shouldn't be doing. You should have thought about it a little bit more and think about the longer term consequences instead of the short term gains, perhaps.
Jeremy, Danielle, any additional notes on this topic?
Yeah, if I can jump in, one, just to talk to what Molly talked about with dark patterns. I think it's not only that people are making design choices, but some companies are actually funding millions of dollars of UX research to figure out exactly how they can create these patterns. It's not just, one person, but there's actually whole departments that focus on this sometimes. And I think one of the issues is that a lot of companies just aren't incented right now to not do things like that. There has been a lot of short-term gain for some firms. And I think, all too often you see companies come to market and, there are perverse incentives for them to, do some things that all of us might find a little bit despicable, but that's how you quickly build market share. And then you come to the lawyers and the regulators and figure out how to fix it later. I feel that that's a pretty depressing cycle, but it is one that's pretty common. And while I do agree that there are models that are out there where you can take a decidedly different approach, and it's what we want to be incenting everybody to do, there are challenges on the flip side of that in terms of where I think building in trust might impact other aspects of a product. I mean, certainly in the identity world where I've been engaged, we spent a lot of time, both when I was at NIST and I've continued in my private sector career outside of government. How can you encourage the use of privacy enhancing technologies? And to date, I think the record of companies that are coming into the market with them has been really mixed, in that you've seen a lot of companies, in an effort to try to do the right thing, will embrace something like a privacy enhanced approach to encryption or data access that's really great technically, but the transactions take 3 times as long because there's a whole bunch of computation on the other side. Or you're, in an effort to try and give consumers choice, you're overwhelming them with choice. And so I think one of the areas where we still have a lot of work to do, as a country, as a tech industry, is figuring out how to balance trustworthy or privacy enhancing approaches on the technology side with the basic stuff you need to do to get people to regularly use these products and have a reason to use them. And so I think we're not quite there yet, sadly.
Danielle, we'll give you the last word on this topic.
Yeah, I probably have a little bit of a different take. My background is, I've been a researcher at RAND. I've been an executive director of a nonprofit and a professor, and I run our nonprofit concentration at the School of Public Affairs. And now I'm also the CEO of a corporation. And for the first time, becoming in a leadership role in a private sector corporation, it's the first time I've had to, I didn't walk into the job and people trusted me, meaning people trust professors, people trust nonprofits, they trust researchers at RAND. And suddenly when I walked into the private sector, and a lot of what we do, it's a company that we were able to create after, reaching an IP agreement with the university. So, we brought a lot of our relationships with us from the university, but I talk a lot about the side eye, that I got almost the moment I said, and I decided to run a private sector company because I had never done it before and I wanted to try, and I wanted to see what that would, because I had done these other things and I guess I was a little bored, and so I didn't anticipate needing to spend the first couple of years rebuilding trust with the same customers, the same communities that I had worked with for years. But then I learned that it's okay. I want to provide great jobs. I want to provide a great product, and we need to make a lot of money to do that, and we're moving into the middle markets there. And I've seen all the tools and resources and the private sector that we use. I don't think we engage in manipulative patterns at all, but but what I do now is I transfer what I've learned back to my students in my nonprofit concentration. And I say to them, it's great to have a mission-driven product, but you need to sell it. You need to sell it in the same way that I'm being told to sell my product in a private sector company. And you need to convince people in the same way. So selling and marketing is not dirty. It is okay. And I've even convinced our department to bring in, a marketing and communications course into our nonprofit concentration to tell people you can sell a social mission. And so, now here I am in my own company selling a social mission, but not shying down at all from the fact that we are trying to make a lot of money doing it. And I say that because I want people in my company to live great lives and have big houses and whatever it is. And I'm not going to be embarrassed about that. And the same way that I hope that in the nonprofit sector, we can have the same kind of commitment to wealth building for people who work and choose that career path.
That's a nice segue. And I'm going to go back to Jeremy. You alluded to this as we move from this first area of discussion of conceptualizing trust to a second area of discussion, which is contextualizing trust as one dimension among many, or contextualizing it as one value among others, as other values that you're trying to do in building a company or rolling out a product or a service. You kind of alluded to this, Jeremy, in terms of some of the technical challenges, say, associated with a high level of encryption may reduce usability as it enhances trust. Can you talk a little bit more about some of the trade-offs that you see, and maybe if there's an innovative product that you've been involved with, how you think about these trade-offs?
Yeah, well, I think, look, this particular issue we got into was looking at zero knowledge proofs and how in identity systems could we architect, technology in a way that, somebody who, say a bank who I'm trying to do business with online can know with absolute certainty certain things about me, but they only know certain things and not other things, and there's nobody in the middle who's able to track it all. There's been a lot of work done in the cryptography world on this. In fact, Microsoft's pioneered a lot of it, and we were looking at a product they developed, gosh, it was about 12 years ago now, called UProve. And I remember we did a 3-day workshop on this, and at the end, the conclusion was, it's really sound cryptography. We've got no idea how to build this into a product anybody wants to use, or that anybody, any business wants to buy. And so I think there's still a lot of work to be done from, transitioning from the academic or the theoretical application of a technology to one that's actually commercial and that solves problems for people. And again, there was an issue of, something that you're trying to do, a simple login might take 10 or 15 seconds for the processing to happen behind the scenes because the cryptography was so intense. We see this now as we start to move into, distributed ledger like blockchain, where again, trade-offs between the benefits of it, but latency, how long do transactions take? I mean, I continue to get pulled in, as a consultant now onto projects where they're really in love with the concept of it until they start to roll it out to people. And then, the UX just doesn't really work. So I think there's always going to be trade-offs. And of course, then the challenge is if you can't do this thing that was sort of academically, cryptographically pure, well, what do you do? Then you have to find other approaches, which might involve compromises. But, back to the question we asked before, you can still try to do the right thing. I think if you start at the beginning by saying we want to architect something for trust and we want to, try to be good actors, at that point, you're in a much better place than the companies who frankly just don't care and are trying to raise something out there and scoop up as many customers as possible.
Molly, as Jeremy's talking, I keep thinking, this is what you do, isn't it? As an interaction designer to reconcile.
Yeah, and you said talking about UX challenges with particular patterns that are maybe a little less familiar to people than your average like login, password, everything lives on one server. My colleagues actually have been working on a design pattern library for decentralized systems. I will post the link in the Zoom chat in just a minute. In collaboration with a bunch of designers and technologists, trying to bridge the gap between something that's a little bit technically unfamiliar and the design patterns that we're used to. This is totally doable. We're doing it. We're a nonprofit. This helps, I think. It means that we're able to look at it from a lot of different points of view at once without trying to push any one technology for any one particular reason. But yeah, there are design answers to these complicated technical, for these new technical paradigms. I also, though, as we're talking about how do we build trust with the new technologies, I find myself coming back to what we were already talking about and what Danielle emphasized, is that trust is a relationship. Trust is contextual. Trust happens over time. So trusted by whom? The things that I trust are very different from the things that my dad trusts. The technical tools. I would go so far as to say there's maybe very little overlap. I hope he's not watching. And the other way around too, right? And even within certain tools, like the parts of Facebook that I trust and the parts of Facebook that he trusts are probably very, very different. So thinking about how we can understand who we are hoping to sort of win over is using this horrible language that I don't like, who we're hoping to work with in order to understand why they're not trusting it. If you say this is built using a blockchain, there are some people who are going to be like, great, I'm all in. Yeah, blockchain. I know it's super secure and trustworthy. And then there are people who are going to be like, I keep seeing that word. I have no idea what it means. And now I trust it much, much less. It's really important that we learn this about people, that we meet them where they are, and that we do a lot of work with folks as we are developing these designs, these technologies, these products, instead of just trying to build something that they, quote, should trust in a lab, sending it out to them and then scratching our heads about how come there's no uptake.
Frank, I want to pick up on that idea of trust being relational, as well as this concept of there's trade-offs that Jeremy mentioned. In the context of Microsoft, do you feel like there is an obligation to educate audiences that you interact with about the trade-offs that you're making? And that may be a different level of education, say with regulators or those that are in charge of protecting consumers versus, say, Bernthal as a consumer of the product who maybe it doesn't have the same level of sophistication of at least an industry-specific regulator. How is it on you guys to say, here's how we think about trust? We made this trade-off between usability and trust. Or, is there any obligation along those lines?
Yes, that there is, and it is challenging for all the reasons that you just stated, and that Molly discussed. Different people are at different levels. They have different expectations. I remember through the years being very deeply involved in the privacy discussions for the last 20 years, and watching how those discussions evolved. It was, you need to be transparent about your privacy policies. And everybody went out and created these 150-page long documents. And it's like, whoa, that's too much information. How do you scale it back? How do you provide it, but then you scale it back too much. How do you provide a privacy label? How do you meet people where they are can be a challenge, simply because if you start talking about at scale, everybody's at a different level and different expectations. And, I think it's on companies like us to kind of work with other stakeholders to kind of sort out what the right balance is and what the right structure is. Is it privacy dashboards in the privacy setting? For in the AI space, it's, information provided to the users or the deployers of the technology is super important. And so how do we kind of explain it to them? And then, for the regulators, it's a lot of capacity building in terms of their technical knowledge about kind of how algorithms work, and especially in particular use cases or with particular technical applications, if you will. And so it gets tricky, but it's also an important aspect if to go to trust, to be able to do that and work through that. And sometimes it's easy, sometimes it's a challenge. But we are taking that on, and it's really important. And we build from the learnings in the privacy and security space and taking that forward to emerging technologies.
Danielle, that language of meeting people where they are occurs to me that you guys do a lot of thinking about this. Any additional color that you have?
Yeah, and Molly, you made me kind of giggle, because this is what I think I did this by accident. The very first version of a technology that I ever built was in response to a need that we saw in public health departments to need to measure their networked work. And I said, I want to build a tool. I'm a network scientist. I have the science. Is there anything we could put in people's hands so that they could do this and not have to hire us, at these high rates to do the science for them? And I was in a meeting at Rand, and I saw a student presenting an Excel thing, and he would he'd push numbers over here, and these bubbles would like open and, get big and small. And I went to him and I said, can you help me build a tool? And, he'd never done this. So he opened a Visual Basic book, and with macros and Excel, we built the first version of this tool. And then we put it out in the world, and it was so clunky, but it got adopted really fast. And I attribute that, to two things. One, it was free, but number two, it was in Excel. So I didn't come to people and say, here's this and there was no cloud, right? So that I knew of. And so, there was no way for people to share their data and share files easily, but we said, open this Excel file and then do these things and push these buttons. And so a program officer at the health department would be like, okay, I can do that. I get that. And so we stuck with that. I mean, this is going to sound crazy. One of the versions of our tool was in Excel until 3 years ago because people loved it. We moved it all online and they would be like, what happened to that old Excel tool? But now we're blocked. You can't really email or share Excel files with a lot of macros in them. So, we've completely converted it in general. But when I think about meet people where they're at, I mean, that was critical. All of our competitors, the people around me were building the fanciest thing they could do. And I was like, what's the most familiar thing people could do? And how could they share it with each other? And once we did that, we just had people just like, I heard about that Excel thing. Can I use it? And that's really how we started everything. So it's critical to also, and just one last thing, Frank, I think you mentioned a 150-page document, and how to get it. When, I am a scientist, so when we first delivered that tool, we said, this is so awesome when you get all your data and you'll see 40 measures of your networks. And the users were like, very uncomfortable. And finally we narrowed it to three measures. And then they were like, I'm all in. I can understand those 3 complicated systems measures. And we just ran with that. And I mean, now we're at like 10, and what I learned is like, we can do all our fancy analysis on the back end, and that's where we can charge services and things like that. But the users, they want to, they really, I think, attached to this idea that science was accessible and in reach, and they didn't have to learn new fancy things. And so it's always been really important to me to take science down a notch, not up, a notch to people, and really meet them where they are and say, this is a talk I give all the time, you are a network scientist because you think about relationships, and just making all of it, a very approachable type of process has changed everything for our business outcomes. So really fun to think about, actually.
One more question for the group on this topic is, I'm going to ask you to reflect on trust in the digital world today as compared to trust in analog products of yesteryear, whether that's P.T. Barnum selling a circus ticket, or Bell rolling out a phone service, or Henry Ford selling a car. As a relative value, does trust become more important in the digital world vis-a-vis other values of a business, usability, scalability, what feels familiar? Or is it, we've been here before? How do you think about that? Is there anything different about the digital world when it comes to trust as a relative value, is what I'm asking? Frank, you want to take a swing at that first?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. I mean, I'd love to believe that the notion of trust has always been around. I think if anything's changed, it's perhaps the scale and the variables now that kind of go into what trust is. For a telephone, right? It's does it work? Does it function? Now it's who may be listening in. What are you what are you allowing for on the back end? On your computer, that the same sort of thing. I mean, with an AI application that could have many uses across many different sectors. How do you take into account all of that? How do you take into account the impact on different communities in ways that we probably have never thought about it in the context of a phone, right? Just to use that example. And so I think it's a lot more challenging and complicated, but probably no less important. And yet we still have kind of the usability, reliability aspects that are also important as well.
Other thoughts about this?
Yeah, I think, to build off what Frank said, I do think it's harder. In that, just technically trying to figure out who's who and what's what can be much harder online than it is in person. I think we've certainly seen a lot of real challenges this last year as we've all been forced into home offices, and in-person transactions have more or less been eliminated in a lot of settings. The new opportunities for criminals and fraudsters to come in has been pretty significant. And that's not even looking just at legitimate businesses who might be, as we were talking about earlier, trying to do something to hook you, but maybe not in a way that's particularly trusted. I often talk about, I think people remember Pete Steiner's old cartoon in the New Yorker where the two dogs are on the computer and one turns to his friend the dog and says, "On the internet, nobody knows you're a dog." That cartoon's 27 years old now. It was published in 1993. So those dogs are dead because dog years, and their kids probably too. But the problem's actually with us more than ever. And I'd actually argue it's getting worse in that, that came out, I think I was a freshman in college. It was good for a few yucks about what it was like trying to trust people online. But, most of the stories people had weren't, particularly sinister. Now dogs on the internet are being actively weaponized against us. And so I think, that puts us in a bit of a challenging spot.
Molly, maybe I'll give you the final word on this topic, which circles back to, I think, where you started, which is that trust should not be a superficial consideration. It's got to be deeper than that. Do you see this as something that's changed from the analog to the digital world, that the stakes are just much higher, and therefore relative to other values, we should be thinking about trust as elevated, maybe instead relative to other things like usability, scalability, et cetera?
The first thing I thought of when you said that, honestly, because I live in Berlin, Germany, it's really dark here now. It's 7 p.m. I'm jealous of the sunlight that you all seem to have. The part of Berlin I live in actually used to be behind the Berlin Wall. This used to be part of a communist dictatorship. About 3 kilometers from where I live was a complex where 90,000 people lived. And I know in the building that I live in now, I don't think this apartment, because it would be impractical to have on the ground floor, but were Stasi secret police safe houses that were bugged. I took a tour of the archives of the secret police, and the amount of data that they collected, I mean, just like the kilometers and kilometers of postcards and just like pictures of people's daily lives, the personal details. It's really, you can go, if you lived in this country that now doesn't exist anymore, you can go request your file. And I've talked to people who have requested their files. They're like, they knew everything. They knew what kind of, like they had pictures of my hairbrush with my stray hairs in it. It's wild. So, I mean, I think this question of, no, I don't think that this has become more important. Maybe in the US, it's a bit different because there's not this history. But in Germany, this has translated to a very, very strong culture of data protection, like nothing I've ever seen before. Major supermarkets advertise the data protection of their loyalty cards right along with the amount of money that you will save. The equivalent of Consumer Reports has like data protection front and center as one of the main things that people look at when choosing between products. So I think it maybe has a little more to do with the cultural context that we're used to than digitalization per se. Yes, we have a lot more interactions now, right? Like we just have more interactions with products, more interactions with people, like the volume has gone up. But in terms of the need to feel like you are not being spied on, the need to feel like the world around you has your best interests at heart, I don't think that's necessarily new. I think it's timeless, and that makes it even more important that we continue to fight it and not say, yeah, but it's just so hard with all of this new stuff. There's no way we can police all this. It's growing too fast, too many little micro interactions. And it's all gotten ahead of us. It's not.
For the cinephiles out there, Molly, your comments bring to mind really a terrific 2006 movie called The Lives of Others, which is easy to recommend if people have not seen it. It's an excellent movie on point for that. I'll just, for those who are joining us in attendance, I'll encourage you to drop your questions into Q&A. We'll go for about 10 more minutes, then we'll start to turn to the questions from the audience. But I want to turn to now our final topic, which is operationalizing trust. And the idea that principles go so far, but the devil's going to be in the details. How do you make this reality? And Jeremy, I'd like to start with your experience with NSTIC. That called for Identity Solutions to embrace what were the 8 fair information practice principles. But then you got to go do it and talk about some of the challenges of operationalizing in that context, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, well, I'll say, going back 10 years ago now, the Obama administration, when they were crafting the strategy, put a lot of thought into how do you actually come up with solutions that would be, privacy enhancing and not degrade privacy. And, they sort of settled on, well, let's say that, privacy is important. Let's point toward these, 8 fair information practice principles. And everybody kind of clapped their hands and said, that's great. It's the first time anybody's, formally recognized how important they are, specifically in identity systems in the US. And then we actually sat down and got to figuring out what do they actually mean? I mean, I think Amy was probably one of the first people I had this discussion with. So great. Transparency, individual participation, purpose specification. Okay, that's a nice principle. What does that actually mean when you're architecting a system? The problem with principles is everybody's going to interpret them a little bit differently. They're going to define them a little bit differently. One thing we did within NIST that, is continuing to do good work to this day was actually use this as an opportunity to launch what is now the privacy engineering program that Naomi Lefkowitz at NIST runs, where it started with a way to come up with, essentially a privacy assessment tool to look at how a system was designed and, look at different aspects of it and where it could create privacy risk and, weigh it and come up with mitigations. Now it's become a full framework on its own that's starting to be used not just in the US, but globally by organizations to assess and mitigate privacy risk. I think it is, one, it points out you can't just talk about principles. Everybody says, well, why can't we just do the right thing? And we can point to the 6 bullet points or 8 bullet points. We like to be the right thing. You really do have to go a step or two deeper, even for an organization that wants to do the right things. I think to help them think about what that means, properly and understanding how to architect it. And then, beyond that, I do think that there's, still a lot, we haven't talked too much about regulation today, although I know that's, one of the questions that's come up in the Q&A. But I think as more and more countries start shaking the regulatory stick at industry on this topic, it's actually, getting people, I think, to pay more attention to how do we constructively get ahead of this issue? I mean, look, I'll say I work at Venable. We're a big law firm. So, and I'm in their privacy practice. I'm not a lawyer. There's a longer story there. But, my colleagues are the ones who write those 150-page privacy practices. And we deal with a lot of compliance issues. What we're starting to see now is companies are coming to us and saying, my God, between California and Europe and these 4 other pending bills, different places, is there a way we can just, build a privacy program to get ahead of it? And we're starting to do privacy assessments based on the NIST privacy framework as a way to map back to both the regs that are in place, as well as ones that are probably going to be coming out in terms of new laws and regulations in the years to come. So to me, that's a great success story about how you move from high-level principles around wanting to do the right thing to specific concrete actions.
Frank, I'm going to turn to you. And in the AI context, there's principles like be fair. And the engineer starts to work on operationalizing that and the algorithms. What does that look like in a broad sense? And is there any specific case studies that you've got that, here was an interesting way that we tried to do that?
Yeah, in a broad sense, I think it's a series of emails from the engineers that say, this is great. Tell me how I'm supposed to operationalize fairness. Fortunately, we've got a great team in the Office of Responsible AI, as well as other building blocks, right? It's no one thing when it comes to responsible AI, at least in our learnings. It's a few things. One is building this governance structure, an internal governance structure. We started off with a committee called our Ether Committee, essentially our AI ethics committee, made up of a cross-company group of people providing advice and guidance on challenging issues as they emerged in the company. Soon after, the Office of Responsible AI was created to really look at internal compliance and kind of what that meant. And part of what that meant was, how do we create the rules to kind of standardize the internal process? And so we've created a responsible AI standard to really help guide what those requirements are, set those requirements that then help guide the practices and what individual teams within the company need to do. That also means kind of training and practices to help employees act on what those principles are, and kind of thinking about, the socio-technical implications of what they're doing. We have mandatory training, some basic responsible AI training for all employees. So at least you become aware of the issue. This all goes to kind of how do we build up the corporate culture. An additional layer is for certain high-risk uses that meet certain criteria, that there's an additional review. And we talk about, how do we mitigate any potential issues there, which has helped us, like take a look at risk profiles, how do we set benchmarks, how do we, advise to do operational testing. And it also kind of showed that we also need to help our customers and others that are deploying the technology. And so we've created these things called transparency notes to help them understand kind of how the technology works. But that's a good learning experience for the engineers as well, because they really have to think about how they explain and how the technology works and the implications and what are the right uses and what are the uses that might not be appropriate for that particular technology. And then finally, like we actually create a lot of tools and processes for engineering to develop, some really good engineering practices. And we've got some tools like FairLearn and Interpret ML that kind of really are geared towards engineers and to help make them kind of take a look at the systems that they're developing and see whether or not they're fair. Interpret ML, like how do they, data sheets for data sets, how do they explain the training data and consider the training data that goes into it? And all this goes to me, a really basic fundamental principle here is, it's no longer just about putting out kind of a cool product that you think is really cool. It's taking a step back and thinking about how the product or system is going to be used. Is it right or ready for that particular purpose? Who could be impacted and how? How do you bring in external voices of communities of people that might be impacted by the technology to get their views? And finally, really, and our leadership has said this, Satya Nadella and others have said this, just because you can make this technology doesn't necessarily mean that you should. And it's just a good reminder that, you really have to be thoughtful. And it all goes back to the trust question, really, is like, it all goes to that fundamental. If we want to be trusted, we've got to be asking ourselves these sorts of questions.
I want to continue to kind of build this list of ways that concepts get operationalized, building on Jeremy and Frank. I'm going to turn to Danielle first and then give Molly the last word. So Frank, Jeremy, I heard you highlight things like privacy assessments, which I think of at least as checklists and audits as a way to operationalize the ideas. Frank, you highlighted governance mechanisms, committees, groups that are involved with regular compliance training that allow for a little bit, maybe more of a dynamic, iterative approach between the engineers and some bodies within an organization that do that. Danielle, what other mechanisms come to mind for you as part of the tool set of operationalizing the general principles involved?
Yeah, I find the conversation even here very educational for me. Even I struggle as I guess a developer of products that produce data with wanting the regulations and the guidance and not wanting it, all at the same time and being able to establish internal. But I think having, as much guidance and if trust can be regulated in ways that we can follow so that folks can understand it better, then I appreciate that in so many ways. I know for us, we've had a dilemma. It was a question you asked earlier, Brad, that when I thought of this, so I'll kind of reference that as well. But, we have this enormous data set that we've collected and we've created privacy policies, with our attorneys and so forth that, we try to communicate well, but we have discovered a new way to use the data. And we actually think it will really benefit the communities that we work with, not us even as much as them, but we didn't necessarily ask our users to use their data that way, but we also kind of covered ourselves when we created the policy for this change. So we are conflicted right now. And so one of our mechanisms is to create an advisory council of users and advisors who we can consult with as we internally are trying to make these decisions. And it's important for us to have technology advisors as well as, community-based researchers, and review committees of internal review boards and things like that. But it's a huge responsibility, and it's one we're actually dealing with right now, because we could argue that we will be making, the world a better place. I know that sounds so Silicon Valley, but like the world a better place if we could get these data out there and turn them into a public facing, use case for people who gave them. There's a lot of risk in that. So I don't know if I'm answering the question well, but I find this conversation super helpful even in thinking about that.
Oh, what a great example. Thanks for putting that on the table, Danielle. Molly, I'm going to give you the last word on this before we turn it over to Connor for the first student question. Molly, go ahead.
The tools and structures that Danielle is describing, I think, are absolutely crucial. Advisory boards, user councils, researchers on the ground, engagement with the people that need to trust this technology that you're working with. I want to add another layer, which is that we have not explicitly talked about who these users are. We're kind of using the word users as this big catch-all. The people who trust you least may have a very, very good reason to trust you least. And that might not have anything to do with you, but just because of structural inequality, because of privilege, because of previous encounters that they have had with technology, with surveillance, with police, with government. And it is really, really important. And it's crucial to the ethics and to the survival, I think, in the end of your tool, that those people who are the least likely to trust you and have the most at risk if they do trust you are also part of these processes. This sounds like, it sounds a little bit like a cop-out, because the answer is like, well, talk to people. Yeah, talk to people that you are probably not as likely to be in contact with if what you're working with is highly paid technologists at a technology firm. That kind of automatically like gives you a certain set of beliefs about that technology is like basically good and you can basically trust it. And so the ability to have a network outside of your organization, outside of your company, and to network effectively with organizations doing work on the ground, I think is super crucial to building these bodies that Danielle has been talking about.
Thank you. We have a tradition at Silicon Flatirons, as those of you who have been here before know, called the WISER rule, which is that the first question goes to a student. I am pleased to elevate a student in my corporations class right now, Connor May. Connor, take it away.
Thanks, Brad, and thank you all for being here. That was a great conversation. This relates to a couple questions in the Q&A, so feel free to pull those in before responding if you'd like. But it seems that in recent decades, the average level of consumer trust in the private sector has gone down, while deregulatory government policies have tended to put more trust in the private sector to operate without oversight. Do you think there's a correlation between this greater governmental trust and reduced consumer trust in the private sector? And by extension, what are the most important things the government can do to help companies be both competitive and trustworthy at the same time?
I think there's probably some connection between those two. Although I'd say, to a certain extent, I think some of the issues we're dealing with in digital trust are also driven by the fact that government has been incapable in many cases of actually reacting quickly enough to the pace of change in technology, and has struggled to, sort of understand what's happening. So I do think that's been an issue. And, in terms of what government can do, I mean, look, we're having, debates again in Washington about whether we do a nationwide privacy law that, would be something similar to what the Europeans have done with GDPR, 50-50 at best, maybe. I think that something like that passes. But I do I wanted to come back to, Brad suggested before, I want to make sure nobody thinks that the NIST privacy framework is a compliance tool. It's actually a way to start assessing risk and then engineering privacy into your product, so that you don't have a compliance problem when that reg or that law passes. But it's really, to tout the work that NIST has done here, is outside of regulation. You can still put out standards and guidance from the government side to try and push people in a certain direction, but it's, you can only get so far without the regulatory stick at the end of the day.
So if I can jump in here too, and privacy is a great example. I mean, I remember back in the day when I was at Consumers Union before my time at Microsoft, we used to lament in the civil society community about how wouldn't it be great if we could just get companies to compete on privacy. And after I joined Microsoft, we were one of a few companies, a handful of, like I think there were 4 companies to start, and then a 5th joined, to actually be supportive of the notion of a federal privacy law. And now I think you couldn't find 5 companies that weren't supporting some notion of a federal privacy law. So it's been interesting to see how that issue has developed. It's taken a lot of time, but I don't think we'll have to wait that long on some of these other issues where companies will really look for ways to compete on areas like AI, right? There are a few companies that started with responsible AI principles. Now, you could, any street corner on DC, you could stop somebody, to the extent people were walking around back before COVID, and they would have a set of responsible AI principles, right, prepared, right, by the organization. So now it's a question of, the race to implement them and the race to put those into practice. So a great question, because I think that's how we make change when it's, as we've seen in the United States, it's taken some time for Congress to move. And I think Phil, in the last panel, kind of talked about that a little bit. So great question.
Thank you, Connor. I'm going to go to the Q&A, and this first question actually also comes from a Colorado law student, Eric Barnum, who says, people struggle to evaluate abstract and remote harms. Data privacy can certainly be described as such a harm. What regulations could be put in place to more effectively convey these harms? That is, regulations to help users, consumers, individuals evaluate abstract harms. Are there regulations that you've seen that do this effectively, or what would you look for?
I can try to answer this a little bit. This is where I start to get a little bit out of my expertise, so it's a little bit more of a reflection. But we've just in the last year become HIPAA compliant, and that required us to be certified by an external company, and really changed all kinds of practices inside our own company, from training to making sure everyone had a certain type of computer monitored in a certain way. So that's been one way for us. It's different from, I think, the question here of regulations, but for us, that's been very regulating. And I've mentioned my background at the university. What's been another interesting kind of dilemma for us is that we always had an institutional review board. In this case, COMERB, the Colorado Multiple Institutions Review Board, to review all of our work, and especially when we were working with vulnerable populations or people under age. And we don't, as a private sector company, have access to an institutional review board like that, except by hiring a third party review board. And we're still trying to figure out what's reputable. If the National Institutes of Health say that this group is reputable, should we use them? So I think this is a different answer to the kind of question about how can regulations be in place? But all of these practices that I just mentioned are all in place to reduce harm to people. And there is a history and standards for what constitutes harm in at least data collection and analysis for people that have been well established by universities and institutional review boards and those kinds of compliances. So those have, I think I agree, it's a very difficult thing. And as we think about and become more aware of disenfranchised communities and the structural inequities that are in place right now that are not considered yet in all of those kinds of existing compliance and regulations, there's going to be a need for a lot of newness in that field as we continue to become more willing to grapple with those issues in the future.
Anyone else want to jump in on this question about, abstract harms are hard to conceptualize. And, one thing that it seems to me is deleterious to trust is I've got some vague sense there might be a problem there, but I can't even understand what the harm might be. Jeremy, any role for regulation there?
Yeah, I mean, let me tackle it a little bit differently. So, what regulations could you put in place to effectively convey those harms? I don't think you can. And I think if you do that, actually backfires. And that I think I talked before about one of the issues you get sometimes is you overwhelm people with choice. And I wish I had a better answer there, but I think it's actually going to be a challenge to try and assume that you can put a regulation in place that's going to educate people along the way. And that not to say that we shouldn't try to do that, but I don't know that the government can prescribe how. And just to pivot as well, I'd argue to a certain extent, sort of the first round of privacy laws we've seen that have been so focused on notice and choice are actually trying to do so. Hey, let's give you all of this stuff, but are you actually really giving people a choice? I mean, you can click, no, I don't support this, and then you can't access the service. I think there's a broader discussion to be had in the privacy debate over whether there are some things that should just be outright banned, as opposed to, and I don't know if I'd go too far with that, but there are probably some, behaviors that are just so egregious that we should just say, why are we permitting this? There's no business benefit to this. This isn't benefiting consumers. My concern is if we're just trying to focus on convey things, with, the notice and consent, approach we've had, everybody gets desensitized to it. They just click through, okay, sure, I'll use your product. And, we haven't actually done anything to improve privacy.
That is kind of what it feels like in having lived in Europe at the time the GDPR was introduced. Everybody just now clicks through, boom, 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 accept. I'm not sure it changes people's
cookie windows
behavior
are great,
other
though.
than
They really improve my browsing experience.
these cookies are improving your browsing experience. The question that Connor asked was about trust in the relationship between regulation and trust. I think when the GDPR first showed up, people's trust in the private sector overall went down, because then for the first time we see, right, like they're doing what? I have to accept. But I think eventually that evens out and returns to normal, just because this behavior of accept becomes so normalized. I'm curious what in the US, what has the reaction been to GDPR? How have people proposed this as like, what parts of this work, what parts of this not so much, what's being seen as a success versus a failure?
At a law firm with a privacy practice, it's certainly been great for compliance business. But I will say, as we start to weigh in on the privacy debate, this discussion we've had around, is a regulation or a legal framework that's just rooted around notice and consent actually effective? And, look, what's great for business in the short term and what actually makes sense for people in the long term are two different things. We've been trying to give some thought on the latter side in terms of, is there a different approach here? Because, GDPR has done some good, but as you're pointing out, people are becoming desensitized to it. And is it actually protecting people in the way that you want? And so I do think some new thinking is useful here.
I'm going to try to get one more question. Go ahead,
okay.
Frank.
Yeah, so I was going to agree with that on GDPR. We are complying with it. I think a lot of people are, but I think there's a lot of things that need to get learned from what works and what doesn't work. I think that the jury may still be out there. Just one thing on the harms question, real fast. I just commend you to take a look at the European regulatory proposal on AI. They try to categorize kind of the notion of high risk uses where, there's an impact on human rights, there's some consequential decision that gets made. Think about financial services decisions, or there could be a chance of physical sort of harm, and kind of they start to, look at those categories, as well as, perhaps some industries where, the question may come up more than others. And so you might want to take a look there, but I think people are starting to think hard about kind of what it means in the right context.
We've got 1 minute left, so it's gonna have to be quick, but I think this next question from Rich Peach speaks to industry self-regulation and building on the idea of a trust framework. Do you see a trusted framework standard that could be agreed upon and use that would require companies to follow an approach like Microsoft's Trust Center or Salesforce's Trust Commitment, which is a highly visible one. Any sense about the role of industry self-regulation in adopting a standard in this area that comes to mind?
Just real fast, I'll jump in. I think it can play a role. Ultimately, it's not going to be the ultimate solution to this. I think it's going to be a mix of industry self-regulation and regulation. Regulation is going to be needed for some uses. If we want to see trust, it'll make sure that there's compliance, enforcement, and kind of clarifying what the rules of the road are.
So companies that start with F and rhyme with Schmacebook are going to write the rules that they have to play by?
She said skeptically. All right, well, we are at the end of our time, and man, this has been a ton of fun. Molly, Danielle, Frank, Jeremy, thank you for a rich, insightful, and really invigorating discussion. I'm going to turn it back to Amy, but I'll ask people virtually to join me in a round of applause. This is great. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.